Hey friends, settle in because tonight we're uncovering something unexpectedly cozy, slightly splintery, and entirely true. Picture it. You trudge off a creaky wooden boat, still queasy from months at sea, your boots soaked in brine and your skin kissed by a sun so intense it feels personal. Before you lies a vast, stubborn continent called Australia. It's 1788. You're technically a settler, which is a nice way of saying figure it out yourself survivor. The air hums with insects you've never seen before. The trees bend like strange sculptures, and everything either stings, bites, or burrows. You're exhausted, hungry, probably overcooked by the sun, and worst of all, you have absolutely nowhere soft to sleep. Quick favor. Before you dive into full-on relaxation mode, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate it if you do. If not, no worries. I'm just glad you're here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing how far this little bedtime campfire travels. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Let's take a moment to leave the noise of the day behind. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on this sun-baked shore with nothing but a few crates of government-issued tools, some military discipline, and a gnawing realization that camping is about to become your full-time job. The ship has vanished back to England, taking its feather mattresses and proper sheets with it. All you've got now is dry land, a pack of half-suspicious colonists, and your own wits, which, let's be honest, are probably running low after that week-long food ration of salted beef and weevil crackers. You look around and realize that the trees are tall, the ground is uneven, and the closest thing to a pillow is either your shoe or your jacket folded just wrong. There are no inns here. No charming cottages with creaky bed frames. Not even a half-decent hayloft to crawl into. You are in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by eucalyptus and eerie silence, and bedtime is suddenly your most daunting challenge. The earliest settlers of Australia weren't building homes right away. They were scrambling for shelter, food, and fire. Beds came later, and only after the basics were squared away. Until then, you slept on dirt, bark, or if you were lucky, a wooden plank propped between two stumps and covered in something vaguely soft. Or maybe you didn't sleep at all. Maybe you just laid there, staring at the stars, praying that whatever rustled in the bushes wasn't venomous. The first nights on Australian soil were anything but dreamy. Forget pillows. People used their hats, their arms, or occasionally someone else's arm if they were friendly enough or just too tired to care. Mosquitoes buzzed like tiny banshees. The humidity wrapped around your neck like a damp scarf, and somewhere in the trees, a koala screamed like a lost soul, because apparently that's a thing they do. You'd think you'd get used to it. But night after night, the ache in your back deepens. Your makeshift bed begins to mold, and someone always seems to snore like a foghorn. You try digging into the earth to make a softer hollow, then line it with leaves or old cloth if you have any. But even that gets rained on or becomes home to something leggy, Some settlers tried to build crude hammocks between trees, hoping to stay above the ground and out of reach of snakes. Historians still argue whether the hammock thing ever really caught on, or if that's just a romanticized retelling to make the suffering sound quaint. But one thing's for sure, most early beds weren't built as much as they were endured. And here's the real kicker. You couldn't even complain about it too much. There were officers nearby. Complaining meant punishment, or worse, extra duty. So you grunt and shuffle and curl up however you can, possibly next to someone you've never met before, whose hygiene is, how should we say, still evolving. No one had personal space. No one had bed linen, and you definitely didn't have thread counts. The only count you did was how many insects had crawled into your sleeves by sunrise, but you pushed through because that's what settlers did. They didn't have a choice. If you wanted rest, you got inventive, or you went without. That's when bark enters the story almost quietly. You see others peeling it from trees, sometimes to roof a hut, sometimes to cook with, and eventually someone somewhere lays a sheet of bark down and doesn't get up for a good long while. Suddenly bark is bedding, rough, fragrant, and full of splinters, but it's not mud, and it lifts you just enough off the cold earth to feel like something civilized is happening. And let's be honest, it smells pretty great. If you can get past the scratches, you start to notice which bark bends without breaking, which trees flake easiest, which ones repel bugs. There's a whole sleepy science to it, and you are now a certified professor in barkology. You stack sheets of bark in layers, sometimes dry grass or moss between them if it's nearby. The more bark you have, the higher and softer the result. It becomes a ritual: gather, peel, layer, rest. You find your favorite trees, your bedding trees. You whisper to them like old friends. There's even a fringe theory passed around among the older settlers that certain bark sings to you if you arrange it just right under moonlight. Not proven, of course, but after a few sleepless nights, you'll try anything. And that's how your bark bed begins. Not because you're rustic and charming, but because necessity is the mother of splinters. Even the officers, those starched-shirt gentlemen with powdered wigs and stiff backs, start eyeing your bark bundle with envy. They may have canvas tents and army cots, but those smell like sweat and mildew after 2 weeks. Yours smells like eucalyptus and the wild. You become something of a local legend, the bark bed whisperer, offering tips to the newly arrived. Always go for the stringy bark, mate. Never the iron bark unless you want bruised kidneys. The ground becomes more than just ground. It becomes territory. You claim your patch like a monarch of mud, returning to it each night like a bird to its nest. And slowly, painfully, the bark bed becomes a fixture, something familiar, almost comfortable, until, of course, the rains come and it turns into a soggy pile of disappointment. Then it's back to the drawing board, or rather, back to the forest. But you're learning. The longer you stay, the more you adapt. You start carving small ridges into logs to prevent rolling. You use tree sap to hold bark layers in place. You elevate the whole setup on stones to keep it dry. And when someone stumbles on your arrangement, wide-eyed and tired. You offer them half a bark sheet like a king offering half his throne. That's the secret to surviving here. Not just building a bed, but building a way to rest, to let your guard down in a land that never does. You're still sore, but a new kind of sore. The kind that comes from hauling tree bark and stacking logs with slightly more intention. You've gone from sleeping on wet dirt to sleeping on elevated bark platforms, and frankly, that feels like a promotion. But now that the bark bed has become your go-to-sleeping surface, you realize something unsettling. It's temporary. The wind peels it away over time, the insects burrow in, and when the rains hit, the whole thing collapses like a sad lasagna of forest debris. So your thoughts shift, as all tired minds do, towards something sturdier, something with a little more permanence. Something that says, I live here now, instead of I'm definitely fleeing in the morning. Enter bricks, or more accurately, proto-bricks, because no one here has a kiln yet. Not a proper one anyway. You start noticing the soil. Thick, red, sticky in just the right way. It clings to your boots, your hands, and eventually your dreams. Someone clever starts shaping it into blocks, laying them out to dry in the sun. It's a process older than pyramids. You mix it with water, sometimes a little sand, maybe straw if you're feeling ambitious, and you let it bake under the merciless Australian sun. They dry slowly, stubbornly, and half of them crack, but the other half hold together, and now you're standing on potential. Historians still argue whether these early settler bricks were based more on European building techniques, or if they accidentally reinvented methods that date back to Mesopotamia. But you're not arguing. You're just tired. And tired people build in straight lines. You gather the best bricks you can find, or more often make them, and begin constructing something outrageous. A sleeping platform, not a house, not a wall, not even a hearth. Just a rectangle of dignity raised a few inches above the snake line. It's laughably small, maybe 2 feet wide, 4 feet long, and 3 bricks tall. But it's yours. You top it with bark, sure, because the bricks are hard as regret. But now the bark is just the mattress. The frame underneath is solid, stable. It won't blow away in the night or sink when it rains. And maybe, just maybe, you can now sleep long enough to dream again. Your fellow settlers catch on fast. The idea spreads like wildfire, or maybe like gossip, which spreads even faster when you're in a colony with too few secrets and too much mud. Someone starts bragging about their double-wide platform. Another adds a headrest made of bundled reeds. There's even one show-off who adds tiny shelves along the brick edge for what? A candle. A lizard collection. Nobody's sure, but it looks fancy. That's the thing, once people realize you can build comfort, they will. Even if it means shaping one miserable block at a time under a blazing sun with flies swarming your eyebrows. Bricks, it turns out, are more than just material. They're a message. A message that says, I expect to wake up here tomorrow, and that is the birth of something surprisingly deep, a psychological shift from survival to settlement. Beds made from bark were about necessity. Beds built on bricks, those were about belief. You start seeing these platforms grow just a little each week. Someone tries enclosing the sides to keep heat in. Another creates a gap underneath for airflow because, surprise, brick absorbs and radiates heat like a sleepy oven. By now, you've discovered that if you lay flat on bricks in the summer, you cook. But if you raise your bed just high enough and let the breeze sneak through, you get something beautiful, a bed that breathes. It's the kind of thing you'd brag about back home if you ever went back. And while there's still no feather pillows or duvet covers, you start to see personalization sneak in. A scrap of old uniform becomes a head cushion. A bit of smuggled lace from someone's trunk is draped over the edge, ridiculously and beautifully out of place. The colony, in all its rough-edged madness, now has beds that look almost intentional. They aren't glamorous. They won't make it into history books or museum exhibits, but they work. And more importantly, they represent the transformation of a place once feared into a place you can live. Of course, none of this solves the termite issue, or the rats, or the comically large spiders that stare at you like disappointed landlords. But the brick beds hold up. And sometimes, when you lie back on your bark mattress-topped rectangle of reddish pride, you feel the wind shift just right, and for the first time in weeks, you don't dream of leaving. You dream of building, of permanence, even if it's just one brick at a time. By the second month, there's quiet competition. You hear whispers about who has the smoothest bricks, the most symmetrical frame. Someone adds a footrest carved from driftwood. Another swears by layering possum fur between two sheets of bark for insulation. Historians don't always agree on how widespread these brick beds were, or if most settlers stuck with bark through the early years. But old journals describe elevated clay bunkers and platforms of hardened earth. So someone out there was getting creative with the landscape. You start noticing something else too. The beds aren't always inside anything. Sometimes they sit in the open, under a canopy of stars and tree branches, like ancient altars to the gods of exhaustion. It's peaceful in a way that's hard to describe. The bush sings its usual strange lullaby, half bird call, half cryptid, and your brick frame soaks in the warmth of the day, releasing it in slow waves against your spine. It's not exactly luxury, but in a way it is. Because now sleep doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like strategy. And each time you lie down, you remember how far you've come from that first muddy cot of misery. Even your dreams seem to be adjusting, less about home, more about here. You dream of cool breezes, of towering gum trees swaying above your resting body. You wake up not disoriented but present. You're still in a wild place, but now you've carved out a space for stillness. And that changes everything. The thing about a brick bed is once you have it, you start wondering what else you can build around it. Because a bed without a wall is just a very hopeful slab in the middle of nowhere. And while sleeping under the stars sounds romantic, especially when you say it out loud to impress the new arrivals, it loses some charm when the rain slaps your face at 2 in the morning. So you get ideas. You look at your little brick rectangle and think, what if I put a lean-to here? A few branches angled over the headrest. A bit of canvas if you can trade for it, or bark slabs lashed together if you can't. It starts small, like all the best revolutions, just an attempt to stop raindrops from colonizing your ear canal while you're dreaming. But then you add sides, maybe just one at first, maybe two to block the prevailing wind, which always seems to carry a hint of kangaroo fur and someone's burnt breakfast. Now the bed feels different again. It's less exposed, more like a room, even if it's only the ghost of one. You drape a jacket over the entrance, and suddenly it's not just a bed anymore, it's yours. Private, sacred, silent, and this is how your Barkhan brick frame becomes the nucleus of a sleeping structure. Not a home yet, but definitely a pod. Historians still argue whether these early micro-shelters evolved directly from the classic English wattle and daub cottages, or if they were mostly improvised in response to the strange terrain and stranger weather of Australia's edge. You don't argue. You're too busy reinforcing the back wall with mud and pebbles, trying to keep the possums from scratching at your scalp while you sleep. The nights get quieter, not because the wilderness has mellowed, but because you have. You're getting used to it now. The squeak of a sugar glider doesn't launch you into panic. The distant howl of a dingo makes you roll your eyes and pull the bark tighter over your head. That's growth. You even learn to sleep through the low, insistent droning of mosquitoes the size of conspiracy theories. The lean-to turns into a hut. Someone invents a rudimentary latch from a bit of twine and an old fork. Yes, really. And suddenly you have a door. It creaks, it flaps, it occasionally falls off entirely in the wind, but you can close something now. And in a land where every animal seems to have venom or claws, or worse, both, that means peace of mind. Someone a few plots over builds a chimney badly and smokes themselves half to death before realizing the hole should be above the fire, not next to it. Trial and error, baby. That's how architecture works out here. And what you notice more than anything is how the brick bed remains the heart of it all. The walls change. The materials rotate between bark, stone, woven reeds, and whatever's left over from a failed boat project. But the platform stays the same, strong, unbothered, warm in the winter if you pile bark high enough, cool in the summer if you open both sides and let the wind pass through like a lazy ghost. By now, you've started to add flourishes. Somebody uses red ochre to paint a little design along the brick sides. Someone else sculpts animal figures into the edges, crude, sure, but recognizable. A kangaroo that looks like a sock. A snake that might also be a badly drawn hose. Art, in other words. And the beds start to reflect personality. There's a woman with a high brick frame and bark sides, so polished they shine like lacquered driftwood. There's a man whose bed is surrounded by scavenged tools, like a bizarre shrine to utility. He sleeps among hatchets and nails, and no one really asks why. Every person builds differently, but the goal is the same. A space where your body can stop bracing for impact. You know you've succeeded when you wake up and don't immediately clutch your side from sleeping on a rock or a root or a piece of regret. Because this is what the settlers discover, slowly and awkwardly. That bedding is about far more than sleep. It's a statement of permanence, of boundary, of belonging, and also, let's be honest, of not wanting to die of exposure. Historians point out that early Australian structures rarely lasted more than a few years without constant repair, especially in the coastal colonies. The termites were too clever, the weather too mood-swingy, but those brick beds, some foundations were reportedly found decades later, long after the walls and roofs had surrendered. The beds remained. That's legacy. Even now, your back doesn't fully trust it. You lie down slowly. One knee then an elbow, like easing into a polite agreement with gravity. But when the frame doesn't shift, when the bricks hold and the bark doesn't crumple beneath you, you exhale. And that exhale is the first step to something you haven't felt in months: rest. Not sleep, rest. That thing that arrives when you believe, even briefly, that tomorrow might not be worse than today. You fall into it. The bed cradles you like an awkward cousin, firm, reluctant, but there when it counts. Outside, someone is coughing. Someone else is singing. A lullaby in a language you don't recognize but understand all the same. The stars blink overhead, and your brick box of survival hums beneath you, radiating borrowed heat from the day like a sleepy dog refusing to move. By dawn, the hut smells of bark and damp socks, but you slept. And in this land, that's a win. Because the truth is, a bed doesn't have to be soft to be sacred. It just has to be yours. So here you are, lying in your bar-climbed, brick-based bunk like some kind of wilderness aristocrat, and it hits you. Sleeping might finally be survivable, but comfort is still just a rumor. Because a bed without a mattress is basically a negotiation between your spine and whatever you manage to throw on top of the bricks. And that, my dear friend, is where the stuffing wars begin. Now, you might think, just use a pillow. But no, pillows are a luxury item out here, like sugar or days without blisters. So instead, you start testing the landscape like a confused scavenger. Leaves, moss, dried grass, anything remotely squashy becomes a candidate. You remember one guy who tried eucalyptus leaves. Seemed like a great idea until he discovered the oils were basically nature's vapor rub, and he spent the entire night involuntarily weeping from his own face pores. Eventually, someone realizes that old clothes make decent padding. Not great, not even good, but at least you don't wake up with a twig embedded in your spleen. You gather threadbare shirts, socks with holes the size of confidence gaps, and bundle them into a lumpy approximation of a mattress. And suddenly, it's better. Not luxurious, mind you, just better. You can now sleep on your side without hearing your hip bone beg for forgiveness. Historians still argue whether early settlers brought mattress-making knowledge from Europe, or if they just winged it entirely once faced with the reality of zero geese and too many bugs. You suspect it's a bit of both, because one day someone drags in a burlap sack stuffed with kangaroo fur clippings and declares it pillow adjacent. It smells weird. It molts. It's somehow always slightly damp, but you have to admit it's softer than bark. And that's how innovation creeps in. one smelly sack at a time. Eventually, settlers begin stitching together layers of coarse cloth and filling them with whatever's available. Feathers from unlucky birds, tufts of wool if they are lucky enough to have sheep, or even bracken ferns that don't immediately crumble into dust. There's a quiet revolution happening here, one sneeze at a time. Mattresses become patchwork creations, part farm, part fashion disaster. You hear someone brag about their triple-layered mattress like they've just invented flight. But when you lie on it, yeah, it's actually not bad. Soft enough to trick you into dreaming about other soft things. Bread, clouds, decisions you didn't regret. Soon, beds are being ranked. The bark brick base is standard, sure, but what's on top? That's where the prestige kicks in. One settler even lines their bedding with possum pelts, which is both deeply unsettling and weirdly effective. It's warm. It's plush. And it makes a noise when you roll over that you try not to think about too hard. Over time, bed making becomes a low-stakes competition among neighbors. Someone starts using twine to hold their stuffing in place, makes a kind of net that keeps everything from sliding to one corner by morning. Someone else reinforces the brick edges with a line of smooth pebbles, partly to discourage termites, partly because it just looks cool. Your own bed starts to feel like a project, not just a necessity. You replace your bark slats with smoother strips, sanded down with the blunt side of a broken saw blade. You learn which fabrics stay warm even when damp. You avoid anything with fur that makes your skin itch for 3 days. There's a kind of wisdom in all this that isn't written down. No manuals, no diagrams, just quiet trial and very loud error. And every night you crawl onto your evolving sleep platform, you feel a little less like an invader and a little more like you belong. Now, fringe fact incoming. One enterprising settler reportedly invented a kind of bark coil spring by weaving narrow strips of tree bark into tight spirals and layering them under the mattress. It didn't catch on, mostly because it squeaked like a haunted harmonica, but still, points for creativity. There's also a rumor of someone who used dried seaweed as insulation, claiming it kept the bed cool in summer and warm in winter. No one ever figured out if it worked, because the smell drove every living creature away, including the person who made it. That's the thing about these bed experiments. They are part science, part stubborn hope. Because in a world where danger comes from every direction, weather, wildlife, weird diseases with 18th century names, your bed becomes your bunker, a personal fortress against the sheer chaos of colonizing a continent. You lie there some nights and trace the outlines of your brick base with your fingers, feeling the cool, uneven surfaces that have supported you through exhaustion, hunger, and more bad tea than you ever want to admit. The mattress sags in the middle now. There's a lump near your feet that no amount of stuffing seems to fix, but it's yours. And when you lie flat, arms behind your head, eyes half closed, you can almost convince yourself that you're not on the edge of the world. That maybe, just maybe, you're building something that'll last. It's easy to laugh at the awkward comfort hacks of the early settlers. but you also kind of admire them. Because comfort isn't just physical out here, it's defiance. Every improvement to your bed is a little rebellion against the idea that this place is supposed to break you. And in that defiance, there's something close to beauty. By the time the stars come out, again, always the stars, you're grateful for every straw, every thread, every sad little fabric scrap that cushions your bones. It's not much, but it's enough to dream on. And that out here makes you practically royalty. You wake to the faint sound of wind brushing through tall grasses, a kind of whispering hush that reminds you where you are, and how far you are from feather duvets and four-poster beds. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but the sky has begun its daily stretch, yawning pinks and dusty oranges across the wide dome above you. You sit up on your creaky, improvised nest of fabrics and bricks, and instinctively reach for the blanket, or rather, whatever passes as one today. Early settlers didn't exactly bring heated throws or memory foam toppers in their wagons. They had wool if they were lucky, animal skins if they were resourceful, and sheer grit if they had neither. That blanket over your lap, probably a stitched-together affair of coarse cloth and hope. Now let's get real for a moment. You can build the best bed the bush has ever seen, but without warmth, it's just a box for slow freezing. And nights in early Australia were not always tropical affairs. Contrary to what every tourist brochure suggests, vast parts of the continent get cold, crack your knuckles, bite your nose kind of cold. So the bedding game became a question of insulation, not indulgence, and that meant layering, improvising, and on more than one occasion wearing your coat as a blanket and your pride as a pillow. Wool was the gold standard, of course. If you managed to trade with a nearby farm or shear a sheep yourself, congratulations, you were now the proud owner of the least washable, most fire-prone textile known to man. But it held in the heat, and that made it precious. People stitched wool scraps into crude quilts, often backing them with flour sacks or canvas. If you found an old sail, well, now you were basically a bedding baron. You could slice that thing into rectangles and pretend the ocean hadn't almost taken it with it. Some settlers even padded their walls with layers of cloth to trap heat, making their entire sleeping area feel like a half-finished insulation experiment. Historians still argue whether most of these early quilts were based on European patterns or simply stitched in the dark with pure survival energy. Either way, nothing looked like it matched and no one cared. Fringe fact time. One old diary tells of a settler who filled a long pouch with warm coals, then wrapped it in a sock to act as a makeshift bed heater. Effective, yes. Fire hazardous, absolutely. Another account mentions settlers using bricks heated by the hearth and slid under the blankets, a method not unlike a primitive hot water bottle but with more opportunities for burnt toes. You try that one night, the bricks warm, the bed's drafty, and it all feels strangely luxurious until you roll over in your sleep and kick it across the room with a bang that would have scared the last emu off the property. So you go back to basics. Multiple layers of animal skin, a wool tunic draped over your knees, and a knitted something from someone who didn't know how to finish corners. You think about how blankets back then weren't just things you slept under. They were tools. You wrapped them around your shoulders during late-night checks on livestock, used them to muffle crying babies, and occasionally wore them straight to work when the morning chill made buttons feel optional. Comfort became communal. You'd hear stories shared around the fire about who'd found a good fleece source, or which neighbor was clever enough to sew rabbit pelts into something that resembled a bedspread. Not soft, not light, but warm. There's even word of someone attempting a blanket made entirely of kangaroo tails. Whether that's ingenuity or fevered madness, no one ever really decided. But it happened, and it worked sort of. You hear whispers that some folks kept bottles of rum beneath their blankets to warm the toes and ward off spirits. Let's be honest, it was mostly to keep the cold from seeping into their bones while they tried to dream of home. And while that's not an approved sleep aid by modern standards, you admit there's something endearing about the image of a settler burrito wrapped in every available scrap of cloth, muttering just 5 more minutes to the frostbitten morning. Quilting became more than an art form. It was a defensive strategy. If you could sew, you were valuable. If you could sew fast, you were a legend. Needles were guarded like treasure, and thread was never wasted. Old garments were unpicked and reworked again and again, until the fabric gave up its molecular will to live. You run your hand over your current blanket. There's a patch from your old shirt, a corner from a neighbor's apron given in trade. And the edge, frayed and thin, was once part of a tent fly that survived one too many dust storms. It's not just warmth, it's history. And you lie back beneath it with a kind of pride that's hard to explain unless you've ever looked at something truly ugly and thought, yes, I made that, and it works. There's no symmetry, no label, no fluff, but there's comfort. And out here, that's rare enough to cherish. One neighbor claims she found a way to waterproof her blanket using boiled down tree sap mixed with ash. She draped it over her bed on stormy nights and swore it kept the damp out. No one could replicate it, and the blanket eventually hardened into something resembling a giant tortilla, but it became local legend anyway. You wonder what people will say, years from now, about the beds you build here, about the scraps and skins and smoky blankets pulled tight across tired shoulders. Will they laugh? Will they marvel? Will they even believe this was real? Because some nights you barely believe it yourself. But then the wind picks up again. You pull your blanket tighter, and in the muted silence of a world still half asleep, you know the answer. They'll understand. Because in every thread, every patch, every scorched coal brick and stuffed sack, there's a simple, universal truth. Everyone just wants to sleep somewhere that feels like safety, even if that somewhere smells vaguely of sheep and has a possum footprint on it. The wind has settled now, curling softly beneath the hut's bark eaves like a tired animal circling down to sleep. You shift beneath your pile of misfit blankets, the weight comforting in a way you hadn't expected when you first laid eyes on this tangle of fabrics, skins, and canvas scraps. But as with all things out here, you've grown to appreciate function over form and warmth over anything remotely resembling fashion. Morning light eases in slow yellow-gray, peeking between the gaps in your makeshift walls. The kind of morning where dew clings to every surface like it hasn't made up its mind whether to freeze or evaporate. You stretch, your joints cracking slightly as if they too were made of scavenged parts. Today's task: stuffing the bed. Not in the Martha Stewart sense, no. This isn't a boutique mattress topper you're fluffing. This is the gritty, itchy, sneeze-inducing business of filling the bed base with anything remotely stuffable. Because down here you make your own comfort, one dried weed at a time. You lift the edge of your bedding to inspect the underlayer. Old flour sacks stitched together into a kind of mattress shell, now partially deflated from a season of being slept on. Its original filling: leaves. Dry, rustling, eternally pokey eucalyptus leaves. A choice made less for their plushness and more for their abundance. And the added bonus of deterring bugs with their pungent oils. Fringe benefit: eucalyptus scent really opens the sinuses. Fringe drawback: try lying still when your bed crinkles like a dry newspaper every time you exhale. So you roll the thing out into the sun, letting any dampness evaporate and bugs crawl out if they are smart enough. Then it's time for the refill. Some settlers swore by dry grasses. Others preferred straw when they could get it, though it flattened quickly and tended to mold if moisture sneaked in through the floorboards. Historians still argue whether stuffing beds with kangaroo fur was a stroke of genius or just a phase that ended with too many flea infestations. You gather a fresh batch of bracken fern, stripping it from the hillside with a woven sack slung over your shoulder. The fronds curl like green question marks, their feathery fingers ideal for layering. They'll dry down well, crunching under the weight of your sleep without totally collapsing. But some neighbors think they can do better. One family stuffs their mattress with shredded bark, the kind that peels naturally from trees like curly wood ribbons. They claim it's springier, that it repels insects, and according to a whispered tale, one of the kids swears he saw a snake use it as bedding before they scooped it up. So now their bed has a nickname: the Serpent's Couch. Cozy, if you're into that kind of thing. And there's the ever-bold duo who decided to experiment with dried mosses. Gathered from creek banks and shaded logs, the moss beds started as genius ideas, soft, spongy, and cool, until a heavy rain turned them into cold, swampy nightmares. One settler had to wring out his bed like a towel and sleep sitting up for 3 nights while it dried. They never tried moss again. You've also heard murmurs about beds filled with chaff, the husks left from threshing grain. Soft, plentiful, and light, until the mice come sniffing. And trust me, nothing ruins a night like hearing a mouse zip line through your mattress stuffing at midnight. One woman, known in your camp as Feather Maggie, made the bold claim that she once had a feather bed back in Hobart. People look at her the way children look at astronauts. Feather, like bird feather, from actual birds. Not possum fur or plucked emu down, but real, fluffy goose feather, unbelievable, almost scandalous. Of course, no one ever saw the legendary feather bed. She says she traded it for a piano part and half a sack of flour during a desperate winter. Historians still debate whether she made the whole thing up to feel fancy, or if there really was one feather bed that graced this raw earth before vanishing into barter history. As you restuff your own mattress, kneeling in the dust while the breeze dries your work sweat, you consider innovation. You start adding thin strips of bark for springiness, a layer of dry hay for body, and a final top-off of soft fern. Then you press it all down with your weight, evening it out with a few rhythmic hops. It's almost like stomping grapes, only scratchier, and your reward is sleep, not wine. Once the bed is refilled, you reattach the sack cover with your painstakingly saved iron pins. No one uses buttons out here unless they've got money to burn. And you don't. You remember an old trick someone taught you, adding dried mint leaves in the mattress lining to keep pests out and leave a nice scent. So you scatter a handful in just for good measure. The bed smells like an herbalist's cupboard now, which you count as a win. A neighbor once tried adding lavender to his mattress, said it made his dreams too vivid. He claimed he saw a dancing sheep wearing boots and now refuses to touch the stuff. You tuck that story away in your mental notebook, where all the best and strangest bush tips go to live. You drag your new bed frame, now heavier and bulkier, back into the hut. Your arms itch, your knees are sore, and your nose is full of bark dust. But there's a pride in this discomfort, because you know what you've made. Not just a bed, but a personal fortress against the hard ground, the cold air, and the relentless noise of living on the edge of everything familiar. You sit back, brush a beetle off your sleeve and sigh. Not bad at all. There's a strange sense of triumph in knowing that what cradles you tonight was entirely your doing. Gathered, arranged, packed with care. And sure, it may squeak, and sure, it may smell like someone's yard clippings, but it's yours, all yours. Evening seeps into the valley like a slow ink spill, the sky turning ochre behind the ridge as the hut breathes in the chill. The fire's been lit low and steady, not so much for cooking now as for keeping the dark from pushing too far in. You sit cross-legged on the floorboards, cup in hand, filled with something that claims to be tea. It tastes like boiled optimism with a hint of mint leaf and grit, but it's warm, and that's what matters. Across the clearing, shadows stretch long and quiet. Somewhere a possum screams like a banshee, its nightly reminder that nature here comes with sharp claws and poor manners. You don't flinch anymore, you just sip. Because tonight, for once, you've made your bed, and soon you'll lie in it. But first, there's the small ritual of shaking out the top blanket, not for neatness, but for vermin. There was the infamous centipede incident last month. No one wants a repeat. The bedding itself is a Frankenstein of fabrics, part sailcloth from a wrecked dinghy, part curtain from the old mill house, and a suspiciously velvety scrap that may have once adorned a theater backdrop before it wound up here, moth-bitten and damp, stitched together by calloused hands. Each patch tells a story. Not necessarily a glamorous one, but definitely one involving resourcefulness and thread bartered from a passing trader who wanted firewood and flattery. As you tuck the corners in, you remember a trick from the woman in the next camp over. Tuck dried lemon rind under the pillow to keep away spiders. You tried it once. It worked, but your dreams were citrus-flavored and slightly unsettling. Tonight, it's mint and hope again. You ease into the bed, the mattress giving a satisfying crunch like someone stepping on a paper bag filled with forest. There's a comfort in the roughness now, a reassurance in the strange squeak of eucalyptus leaves and the way the dried bark shifts just enough to cradle you without swallowing you whole. You think back to how alien it all felt when you arrived. Now, it's not a bed, it's a nest, a den, a fortress, and maybe that's what home is in this place. Not walls or roofs, or anything bought from a store, but the knowledge that you've made something that can hold your shape, something that waits for you at the end of each blistering day and whispers, "Yes, this too is yours." Outside, the stars begin to smudge across the sky like thumbprints. A frog croaks in the creek bed. The wind combs gently through the bracken you didn't take. And as sleep closes in, you realize tomorrow someone will ask how you slept. You'll say, "Better than I should have." And you'll mean it. Morning arrives like a rumor, soft, persistent, and hard to ignore. The mist hangs in loose knots across the trees, draped like forgotten laundry, and the first light doesn't shine so much as it seeps, slow and damp and indifferent. You blink awake before the birds start, before even the insects have warmed up their wings. There's no alarm. Your body just knows. The fire's out. You knew it would be. You wrap the blanket around your shoulders like it's armor, and pad across the floor with the soft tread of someone who's learned that unexpected crunches in the dark usually mean regret. Outside, dew clings to everything. Your boots are soaked before you've taken 3 steps, but you stopped caring about that a long time ago. There are worse ways to begin the day than with wet socks and breath you can see. Breakfast is a ritual. Not for nourishment, not really. It's more like a ceremony of existence. You boil water in the dented kettle that whistles like an asthmatic crow. Oats with salt. 1 spoonful of powdered milk. It's not good, but it's honest, and that's harder to come by than flavor these days. You sit on the log you've christened the throne. It's not comfortable, but it has the best view of the fog unraveling through the valley like a second river. The silence here is thick. It doesn't just fall, it presses. And in that weight, you can hear things people forget to listen for. The slow drip of last night's rain from the gum leaves, the shifting soil as something burrows just beneath, the rhythmic creak of the trees breathing in the morning. You chew slowly, each bite a metronome. Time passes differently here, if at all. Later, you'll check the traps, your lazy nod to protein intake, though mostly they yield either nothing or one very angry marsupial you let go after a shared moment of embarrassment. The garden needs turning, the water tank needs patching, the east-facing solar panel needs the eucalyptus shade trimmed back again. But all of that can wait another minute. Maybe 2. You reach for your notebook. The one you swore you'd fill with poetry but now holds mostly supply lists and increasingly cryptic weather notes. You write, June 4, mist thick, kettle survived, socks wet, soul unclear. You pause, then draw a little cartoon spider wearing a crown. It's the closest thing to religion you've practiced in months. This place, this rough patch of stubborn earth you've claimed, isn't paradise. It's not even particularly kind, but it lets you exist. It doesn't ask anything except attention. It doesn't pretend to care, and in doing so, it teaches you how to. You finish your oats. The bowl goes unwashed. For now. There's something satisfying in the ritual of doing it later, when the sun is higher and your fingers don't feel like twigs. For now, you just sit and watch and breathe. And remember that even the slowest mornings still count as beginning again. The days blur in the way a river forgets its eddies. You begin to track time less by date and more by pattern. The call of the yellow-tailed black cockatoos signals a shift in weather. The way the shadows lean across the ridge tells you it's mid-season, not mid-morning. Your body begins to keep its own calendar. Your knees ache more when the rain is close. Your skin toughens like bark. Even your hair begins to carry the scent of ash and eucalyptus no matter how often you wash. One afternoon, while splitting wood beside the shed, you find a nest tucked into the eaves. 3 small, blind chicks gape up at you, necks trembling with need. You don't know what species they are. You don't really care. You just stand there holding the axe like a question and whisper, "It's okay." As if that means something, as if they know. Later, you sit near the fire with a tattered book of constellations, trying to find shapes in the blanking sky. It's clouded over, but you trace the stars anyway, as if memory could summon them. You murmur names, Carina, Crux, Centaurus. You remember learning them with someone whose face you now recall only in the shape of their laughter. Gone, like the stars behind the clouds, you write in your notebook again. June 12. Firewood dry, birds in the eaves, sky withholding, me too. The next morning you wake to frost. It crests the grass like powdered glass, and your breath comes in clouds. The kettle takes longer to boil. Your fingers don't bend right until noon. You find yourself talking aloud more, to the magpies, to the creek, to yourself, though you use different voices depending on the topic. One for advice, one for warnings, one for comfort. You've started naming things. The kettle is Marjorie. The log pile is Albert. The leech that keeps finding its way into your boot is Esmeralda. She's persistent. You respect that. It's been weeks, months. It doesn't matter, not anymore. Time is something that belongs to cities, not soil. You've stopped checking the radio. It still works. You even change the batteries every Sunday. You think it's Sunday, but you no longer tune in. The static felt too much like hope, and hope, untended, rots faster than meat. Instead, you measure your world in real things. The way the bark peels from the stringy bark tree, the way the ants rebuild their hill, each time you accidentally scuff it. The way your heartbeat sounds when everything else is quiet. You thought you came here to escape, but now you know you came here to return. Return to what? That's harder to say. Not to a place, not even to yourself, but to something deeper than memory and older than thought, maybe not even a return, maybe a remembering. You sit by the fire and let that thought take root. No need to rush it. The night is long, and you at last have time. The wind shifts overnight, bringing a sharpness you didn't expect. It whispers through the hollowed-out branches, a voice older than anything you know. You wake with a start, senses heightened by a dream you can't quite recall. The kind of dream that's not really a dream but a message disguised as one. You rise quietly, careful not to disturb the embers that still glow faintly in the hearth. Outside, the air tastes different, crisper, charged. Your boots crunch against the frosted ground. As you make your way toward the creek, the water runs clear and cold, singing its ceaseless song over the stones. You catch sight of something unusual along the bank, a rough bundle of bark and twigs expertly woven into a shallow cradle. It looks like a bed, but unlike anything you've made before. The craftsmanship is deliberate, the weaving tight, the edges neatly tucked. You realize this is more than just shelter for a restless animal. The local indigenous peoples have been here long before your kind, and their knowledge of the land is embedded in every tree and stone. Historians still argue whether early settlers learned enough from these custodians to influence their own survival strategies, or whether ignorance won out more often than not. You crouch down, tracing a finger along the bark's fibrous texture. This cradle feels like a secret left behind, a whisper in the wilderness. You wonder if it was made for a child or perhaps an infant marsupial. You think about how, back in town, you never paused to appreciate the ingenuity in simple things. The settlers here had to reimagine everything they thought they knew about beds. No feather mattresses shipped from England. No finely carved wooden frames. Only what the land provided, with all its challenges and gifts. They learned to peel bark carefully from the trees, selecting species like stringybark and blackbutt for their pliability and strength. The bark sheets were dried and sometimes softened by soaking, then shaped into rudimentary bed bases. Underneath, they might place dried grasses or leaves to cushion the hardness. Sometimes bricks made from clay and earth were used to create a foundation or frame. These were often handmade, sun-baked by settlers eager to build permanence in a transient world. You've heard that some beds were even raised slightly off the ground to keep away snakes and insects. But comfort was a luxury rarely afforded. You picture yourself lying on such a bed, rigid yet strangely familiar, a testament to resilience, not luxury. You step back, feeling the weight of those lives intertwined with this land. The bed of bark and brick is more than just furniture. It's a symbol of adaptation, of tenacity, of the quiet struggle to make a place called home. As you return to your own camp, you carry that image with you. The rough cradle by the creek becomes a metaphor for your own bed tonight, imperfect, raw, but holding you nonetheless. The sun begins to warm the valley, melting frost and doubt alike, and you settle down once more, knowing that sleep will come, slowly, surely, like the dawn itself. You wake to the sun carving gold edges into the gum leaves. Its light spills in, warm but not harsh, coaxing the day awake slowly, as if not wanting to disturb the fragile peace you've come to cherish. You stretch, muscles protesting the stiffness of sleeping on anything less than a mattress. But there's a stubborn pride in your bones that says this is exactly where you're meant to be. The bed you lie on is a far cry from home comforts. A rough frame fashioned from saplings, covered with bark that crackles faintly beneath you, layered with dried grasses that sometimes invite ants as uninvited guests. It's hard, uneven, and smells of earth and smoke, but it's yours. And tonight, you'll build another just like it, learning to balance practicality with the elusive promise of comfort. Settlers who first arrived in this unforgiving land quickly realized that their European furniture was both impractical and impossible to transport. Ships carried limited cargo, and bulky items like beds were either left behind or dismantled. Historians still argue whether settlers adapted native methods out of necessity or through curiosity and respect. Either way, the bark bed became a common sight, simple yet effective. You run your fingers over the bark, feeling the grooves and ridges, understanding the silent dialogue between settler hands and Australian nature. The peeling of bark was an art in itself, requiring knowledge of the right time of year and the right type of tree. Too early and the bark would crack and splinter, too late and it would be brittle and useless. Sometimes settlers would bake bricks on site, using local clay, water, and sun. These bricks formed sturdy foundations or bed frames that kept sleepers off the damp ground. Bricks also doubled as hearth stones, proving that settlers often used materials for multiple purposes. Nothing was wasted. You imagine the settlers gathering in small camps, sharing stories by firelight, crafting beds as they went, hands raw but steady. There's a strange camaraderie in such hardships. You can almost hear their voices, rough and tired, weaving tales to fill the long nights. The bed is more than a place to sleep, it's a statement. A sign of claiming space in a land that doesn't yield its secrets easily. You lie back, feeling the roughness beneath you, and wonder how many others have lain on similar beds, staring up at the stars, dreaming of a life less raw. You close your eyes, the bark scent mingling with smoke and eucalyptus, grounding you. Despite the discomfort, there's a strange comfort in this primitive embrace. It's real, it's now, and for tonight, it's enough. The days fold into one another like well-worn blankets. You wake to the call of cockatoos, their raucous chatter a soundtrack to your slow, steady work. Bark strips in your hands, rough and fibrous, remind you that every piece you touch once belonged to a living tree. You marvel at the resilience required to coax a home from this harsh landscape. Settlers quickly learn to respect the land's materials in ways their ancestors back home never imagined. You see them bending saplings for frames, shaping bricks with rudimentary molds baked by the relentless sun. The art of building a bed from bark and brick was less about comfort and more about survival. Yet survival often birthed ingenuity disguised as simple necessity. You stop and watch a magpie nesting nearby, a curious observer to your labor. Their nests, woven with grass and feathers, inspire settlers to think differently about softness and support. You note how sometimes settlers line their bark beds with soft grasses or animal skins, a nod to the comforts they left behind. Historians still argue whether these adaptations were influenced by indigenous knowledge or solely settler innovation. Bricks, too, tell their own story. Made from earth, clay, and straw, they were sun-dried or fired in makeshift kilns. Some settlers even decorated their bricks with pressed patterns, an unexpected touch of artistry amid rugged conditions. You imagine those hands, stained red with clay, pressing designs while dreaming of better days. The process was slow, repetitive, often tedious. Yet each bed constructed became a tangible triumph over the wild. You run your fingers along the coarse bark, feeling the texture, the history. You sense the faint imprint of a maker's fingerprints, worn but persistent. You take a breath of the crisp morning air, heavy with eucalyptus and earth. The smell grounds you, reminds you that you're part of this ongoing story, one of adaptation, endurance, and quiet rebellion against discomfort. Night falls again. You settle onto your bark bed, the bricks underfoot cool but steady. Sleep comes, slower now, softer. Because even in hardship, humans find ways to cradle themselves. You drift off, wrapped in the history beneath you. Night deepens, and the fire's glow fades into embers as you lie on your bark bed. The rough texture presses against your skin. Comfort and challenge in the same breath. You think about the settlers' first nights here, stripped of familiar luxuries, their beds an extension of the land's stark truth. The world outside was vast, unpredictable, and unyielding, yet they found ways to create shelter, even for their sleep. Bark beds were not just functional, but also a statement of adaptation. You imagine families huddled close, wrapped in woolen blankets, children's breaths rising in the cold night air. The bark's insulation was meager but better than bare ground. They sometimes layered the beds with leaves, grasses, or animal pelts scavenged or hunted nearby. Historians still argue whether settlers learned these techniques from indigenous Australians or discovered them independently through trial and error. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a blending of necessity, observation, and occasional exchange. You think about the bricks, too. Handmade, often irregular, fired in sun and wind. Some settlers stacked them carefully to elevate their beds. Others built simple frames. The bricks symbolized a foothold in a place that felt temporary but was becoming home. The process of making these beds was labor-intensive. Every strip of bark peeled from a tree was precious. Every brick molded and dried a small victory. Your hands ache just imagining the settlers' persistence. You remember hearing that in some regions, settlers used bark from different trees depending on the season and intended use. Stringy bark, for example, was favored for its flexibility and toughness. Blackbutt and ironbark provided sturdier options but were harder to work. There's a certain poetry to it all, humans weaving their existence into the land, not with nails and screws, but with bark, earth, and patience. You feel the roughness beneath you again, that stubborn reminder that comfort is earned, not given. Sleep creeps in, slow and steady, carrying you into dreams mingled with the scent of eucalyptus and ash. You wake to the low murmur of the bush stirring alive beneath dawn's first light. The world smells of damp earth and freshly fallen leaves, a scent that fills you with a strange mix of calm and urgency. You sit up on your bed of bark and brick, feeling the roughness beneath you like an old friend reminding you where you are. The texture is uneven, but it supports you all the same. Building beds from bark and brick was a skill that settlers refined over seasons. You picture their early attempts, peeling thick sheets of bark under the relentless sun, their fingers blistered and stained with resin and clay. Bricks dried slowly in the heat, their surfaces cracked in patterns as unique as fingerprints. Historians still argue whether these techniques spread quickly among communities or developed sporadically through isolated necessity. You reflect on the ingenuity required to make a bed that could withstand the shifting moods of the Australian climate. Sometimes scorching heat scorched the bark, making it brittle. At other times, unexpected rains softened the bricks, threatening to crumble their hard-earned foundations. You imagine how settlers learned to stack their bricks for drainage and ventilation, an early form of natural climate control. Some beds were raised higher than others, depending on local terrain and insect activity. The decision to elevate a bed was a practical one, but it also created a subtle distance from the unpredictable ground beneath. You pause to consider the role of local indigenous knowledge in these adaptations. Many settler accounts mention guidance or observation of Aboriginal practices, but how much this influenced construction remains a debated topic among historians. You wonder if this tacit knowledge exchange happened quietly, in moments easily overlooked by the written record. You picture a settler family at day's end, gathering around a modest campfire, their beds crafted painstakingly, waiting patiently for them in the fading light. Despite the hard materials, these beds were sanctuaries, places where the trials of the day melted away into the slow rhythm of night. The bark's scent, the coolness of the brick beneath, the crackle of drying leaves. Together, they form a lullaby of survival and hope. And as you close your eyes once more, you're carried gently back into the fold of those early nights. The morning light filters softly through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground where your bed once rested. You stand amidst the scent of fresh bark and drying bricks, feeling the pulse of the land beneath your feet. Every texture, every grain tells a story. The bed you built with your own hands is a bridge between worlds, the old and the new, the known and the unknown. Settlers often chose the type of bark carefully, selecting species like the stringy bark for its pliability, or the iron bark for strength. You marvel at how these choices were learned through experience, often shared by word of mouth in tight-knit communities. They turned to bricks not only for beds, but also for hearths and walls, an economical use of their scarce resources. Historians still argue whether brick-making methods were purely European holdovers or adapted with local influences in mind. You imagine the painstaking process of brick drying. Clay mixed with straw and water, shaped by hand or in crude molds, left to bake under the relentless sun for days, sometimes weeks. The bricks would crack and harden, fragile at first but gaining resilience over time. Occasionally, settlers pressed simple patterns or initials into the bricks, a quiet act of marking their presence in a new land. These marks served as both practical identifiers and subtle declarations of belonging. You think about the nights when bark beds were lined with the softest blankets settlers could muster. Animal pelts from hunted kangaroos or possums offered warmth, a touch of the comforts left behind. The juxtaposition of rough bark and soft fur was a physical reminder of the precarious balance between hardship and home. The scent of the bush, the roughness of the bark, the coolness of the brick, each element a sensory anchor. Settlers were learning to read the landscape not only for survival but for comfort. Their beds were early attempts at domestication, a way to make the wild feel a little less wild. And as you lie down, the wind rustling leaves above, you feel connected to those first restless nights. The beds might have been simple, even crude, but they held dreams, hopes, and the quiet promise of a future. Sleep comes slowly, like a tide easing ashore. You awaken to a faint chorus of kookaburras laughing from the treetops, a reminder that this land has its own timeless rhythms. Your body still feels the imprint of the rough bark beneath you, a tactile connection to the early settlers' endurance. Each day, their beds were more than rest spots. They were carefully crafted refuges in a land that demanded respect and ingenuity. You picture settlers experimenting with bed frames, combining bark with wooden poles scavenged from fallen trees. Some improvised by weaving bark strips between saplings to create suspended sleeping surfaces, elevating themselves away from damp earth and crawling insects. The evolution of bed design was subtle but constant, guided by necessity and growing knowledge of local conditions. Historians still argue whether some design elements came directly from indigenous practices or were independently developed adaptations. The brickwork beneath these beds varied widely. Some settlers built sturdy brick platforms, while others arranged bricks loosely as foundation supports. You imagine how the sun-baked bricks radiated heat during cold nights and offered cooling relief during summer's scorch. There's an almost poetic irony in that these simple materials, bark and brick, became the backbone of early Australian settler sleep. The very earth and trees that posed challenges were transformed into tools for comfort. You think about the settlers' hands, rough and calloused, mastering the art of peeling bark without tearing it. Every sheet taken was a lesson in patience, a test of precision. Sometimes, settlers added layers of dried grasses or soft ferns atop their bark beds, an early nod toward cushioning. You smile thinking about the settlers joking quietly in the dusk, comparing whose bed was the most lumpy or uncomfortable. Sleep may have been a battle, but it was one met with resilience and humor. You can almost hear their whispered stories, laughter blending with the crackling campfire. These beds, humble and imperfect, held the dreams of people forging a new life. As dusk settles again, your eyes grow heavy. You surrender to the slow embrace of rest, warmed by the knowledge that these beds held more than just bodies. They held history. The morning sun streams through the eucalyptus, casting a gentle light that warms your skin as you stretch on your bark and brick bed. You notice the tiny cracks in the bricks beneath you, evidence of seasons past and the relentless push of time. It's strange how something so rough and simple can feel like home. The settlers felt this too, as they molded their sleep spaces from the land's offerings. You imagine their trial and error, some bricks crumbling too soon, others holding firm. The bark beds cracked and curled at the edges as they dried, but they held enough to cradle weary bodies. They learned which trees offered the best bark, how to strip it carefully without killing the tree, a subtle lesson in sustainable use. Historians still debate how much settlers respected indigenous land practices or unintentionally caused damage through their methods. You think about the night air, crisp and filled with strange sounds. Settlers had to sleep lightly, alert to the calls of unfamiliar creatures, the rustling in the bushes. The bark and brick beds weren't just beds, they were tiny islands of safety. Sometimes settlers layered their beds with kangaroo skins, soft and warm. You picture the textures, the rough bark beneath, the soft fur above, and the cool bricks supporting it all. It was a balance of extremes, much like life on this new continent. You can almost hear the settlers' murmurs as they compared their beds, joked about the scratchiness, the lumps, the stubborn bricks. Even in discomfort, they found moments of shared humanity. You notice how bricks were sometimes painted or inscribed with crude designs, a quiet attempt to personalize a place that was otherwise harsh and unfamiliar. These marks are like whispers from the past, tiny footprints of those who came before. As evening falls and shadows lengthen, you settle in again. The rough bed beneath you, the distant calls of wildlife, the cool night air brushing against your skin. You close your eyes, wrapped in the simple comfort born of bark and brick. Sleep comes gently, a soft surrender. Night folds around you like a soft blanket, and you feel the weight of the day lift as your body sinks into the familiar contours of your bark and brick bed. The textures beneath you, rough bark, cool bricks, anchor you to this strange new land. You breathe in the scent of eucalyptus and damp earth, sounds of nocturnal creatures weaving a lullaby around you. You imagine how settlers often used bark stripped from trees like the red gum or the stringy bark, prized for their durability and flexibility. Sometimes they layered the bark with rushes or dried grasses to soften the surface, crafting a primitive mattress that balanced comfort and practicality. Bricks, though heavy and cumbersome, provided a firm base, elevating the bed off the ground and protecting sleepers from moisture and insects. Historians still argue whether these bed-building practices were borrowed from indigenous Australians or independently developed out of sheer necessity. You think about how the settlers' ingenuity extended beyond materials. Some beds featured simple wooden frames made from saplings lashed together, supporting the bark sheets tautly like a canvas. Others constructed small brick foundations to raise their beds, creating airflow beneath to combat humidity and pests. The smell of freshly cut bark mingled with the earthy aroma of sun-dried bricks. You picture the settler families gathering around their beds after a long day, the day's hard work easing away with the soft rustling of leaves and the crackling of campfires. You chuckle softly imagining their grumbles over lumpy bark or bricks that shifted under their weight. Despite the discomforts, these beds were prized possessions, symbols of a new beginning forged from the land's raw materials. You sense a rhythm in the settlers' lives, their bed-building part of a larger dance with the environment. Each bark sheet peeled and brick laid was an act of patience, a testament to their determination to carve out a space for rest in an unpredictable world. As your eyelids grow heavy, you feel the enduring spirit of those first beds cradling you. Sleep takes you slowly, gently, like a soft tide pulling you deeper into the night's embrace. The dawn breaks quietly, filtering through the branches and casting long shadows across your makeshift bed of bark and bricks. You feel the solid weight of the bricks beneath you, grounding you even as your mind wanders to the lives of those early settlers. Their beds were humble creations, but each one carried the unspoken story of survival and adaptation. You picture the careful peeling of bark, a skilled process that required knowledge passed down through community and trial. Settlers learned which species provided the best sheets, thick, flexible, resistant to tearing. The bricks, fired under the sun's unrelenting gaze, varied from batch to batch, their strength dependent on the clay's composition and drying conditions. Historians still debate the extent to which these techniques were refined locally versus imported from European traditions. You imagine the cold nights when the brick foundations helped keep the bed dry and stable, preventing the chill from seeping up from the ground. Settlers often layered their bark beds with soft furs or woven blankets, adding a welcome barrier against the rough textures beneath. You think about the sensory experience, the slight give of the bark under weight, the cool hardness of bricks against your back, the scent of the bush surrounding you. These beds were more than practical. They were intimate spaces where settlers found solace amid the unfamiliar wilderness. Some settlers even decorated their brick beds, carving initials or symbols into the sun-warmed surfaces, a quiet assertion of identity and presence in a vast, unknown land. These marks were small acts of humanity, tiny rebellions against the wilderness's indifference. You sense the rhythm of the settlers' days, the ebb and flow of labor and rest, the constant negotiation between discomfort and necessity. Beds made of bark and brick were a testament to their resilience, a physical manifestation of their hopes for a new life. As the evening shadows deepen and the world quiets, you settle back onto your bed. The rough textures, the lingering scents, the distant calls of the wild, all come together in a soothing embrace. Sleep beckons once more, gentle and unhurried. You wake to the soft murmur of the wind threading through gum trees, the gentle rustle of leaves blending with the distant call of a magpie. Your body feels the familiar contours of your bed beneath you, the rough bark, the steady bricks supporting every inch. This humble bed carries the weight of countless nights spent by early settlers, each night a quiet testament to human will and adaptation. You think about the practicalities settlers faced, how bark sheets were stripped in the cooler hours to avoid splitting, how bricks required patience, sometimes weeks of sun drying to reach strength. Some settlers favored thicker bark, others thinner layers carefully folded for comfort. Bricks came in various hues, from red to ochre, their colors telling tales of the local soil. Historians still debate whether settlers adapted traditional European brick kilns or relied solely on open-air drying methods in the Australian climate. You imagine the hands that built these beds, calloused, patient, sometimes trembling from exhaustion. Each brick laid, each bark sheet stretched was a quiet victory over the unknown. The beds were more than mere places to sleep. They were the first footholds in an alien landscape. Sometimes settlers used green bark to weave crude mattresses, the sap lending a faint aroma that mingled with earth and fire. You smile recalling stories of settlers trading recipes for softer bedding, sharing hints over campfires as night cloaked the bush. Despite hardships, the beds were sanctuaries, their rough edges softened by blankets, furs, and the settlers' determined spirits. You imagine the evening ritual, settlers settling down, the stars beginning to sparkle through breaks in the canopy, a quiet peace settling over the camp. The beds of bark and brick held dreams of home, of family, and of a future slowly being carved out from the wild. As darkness deepens, your eyelids grow heavy. You surrender once again to the slow embrace of sleep, carried gently by the legacy of those who came before. The day fades softly, leaving a cool hush in the air as you rest upon your familiar bed of bark and bricks. You feel the rough bark beneath you, a tactile link to those early settlers whose nights were spent in much the same way. Each brick pressed into the earth tells a silent story of endurance, of hands that shaped shelter from scratch. You consider the ingenuity involved in constructing these beds, how settlers experimented with frame designs to improve comfort and durability. Some used saplings tied with strips of bark as simple bedposts, suspending bark sheets above the ground to avoid dampness and pests. Others built low brick foundations that raised beds just enough to catch cooling breezes. Historians still debate whether these methods evolved through contact with indigenous Australians or arose solely from settler necessity. You imagine the care settlers took in choosing their materials, learning which bark peeled smoothly, which clay made the sturdiest bricks. The rough textures beneath their skin were reminders of a daily struggle, but also of a growing connection to the land. The beds were places of refuge, where settlers could finally relax after exhausting days. You smile thinking about the quiet jokes shared about lumpy bark and shifting bricks, a small human touch amid vast wilderness. You picture the subtle changes over time, bark beds becoming more refined, bricks fired with better techniques, the addition of soft rushes or woven mats. These improvements were small victories, each making the harsh reality a little easier to bear. As night wraps around you, you feel the deep, slow rhythm of the land and its history beneath you. You close your eyes, letting the rough comfort lull you into dreams, the legacy of bark and brick beds a gentle cradle. Sleep comes quietly now, a slow drift into peaceful darkness. The stars twinkle faintly overhead as you sink into your bed made of bark and bricks. The textures press gently against your skin, the rough, fibrous bark and the firm, sun-baked bricks grounding you in this quiet moment. You think of the early settlers who, with little more than patience and grit, crafted these beds from the land itself. They stripped bark carefully from eucalyptus and ironbark trees, knowing which pieces would bend without breaking. They fired bricks in open pits or rudimentary kilns, their strength varying with the clay's makeup and the sun's heat. Historians still debate whether the settlers learned these skills from indigenous Australians or reinvented them through trial and error. You imagine how these beds cradled generations of weary bodies, bearing silent witness to dreams, fears, and the slow shaping of a new life. Some settlers decorated their beds with simple carvings or painted symbols, small acts of identity in a vast wilderness. The smell of bark mingled with earth and smoke, a sensory memory passed down in whispered stories. You feel the calm embrace of the night around you as you trace the patterns in the bark and the slight unevenness of the bricks. Each imperfection speaks of human hands and quiet determination. As sleep gently claims you, you rest in the knowledge that these humble beds were more than furniture. They were the first footholds in a new world, places of rest and resilience forged from the raw beauty of Australia's land. The night deepens, and you drift softly into dreams carried on the legacy of bark and brick. Now, as the story winds to its gentle close, feel the night's calm seep deeper. Let the textures of bark and brick soften into a soothing warmth beneath you. Imagine the eucalyptus trees swaying lightly in a breeze that carries the faintest hint of smoke from distant campfires. Every breath you take is slow and even, matching the quiet rhythm of the land itself. The hardships of those early nights melt away, replaced by a quiet sense of connection and peace. You are cradled by history, held gently in the arms of a world that is both wild and tender. The story fades like twilight, softening edges, until only the quiet remains. Wherever you are, know that you are part of this long, winding tale of survival and hope. The beds made from bark and bricks are symbols of humanity's endless desire to rest, to find comfort even in the most unlikely places. Now, breathe deeply. Let your mind wander softly through the leaves and bricks, the stories whispered in the night air. And as you drift further, carry with you the gentle strength of those who came before, resting easy at last.